All right, I have about 10 a.m. Pacific, so we can start. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending upon your location. And welcome to today's KAMIND webinar, CMMC 2.0, Ways to Reduce Costs and Pass an Assessment. As a reminder, we'll be having one Microsoft webinar on the second Thursday and one CMMC webinar on the fourth Thursday of each month to keep you up to date on what's going on. So if you guys have any ideas for future topics, please let me know. Before we get going today, a few housekeeping items. There will be time for Q&A at the end. So if you can keep your microphone on mute during the presentation, that would be excellent. With many of us working from home, we'd like to eliminate all the background distraction noises. If you have questions mid-presentation, please feel free to use the chat functionality or the raise hand icon, and we'll be sure to weave your questions in best we can during the presentation. Now, with that out of the way, let's get down to business. So the federal government has mandated CMMC 2.0 compliance if you're a Department of Defense prime or subcontractor. So that's one more expense and one more challenge for you to deal with. Hopefully today's webinar will give us some ideas and steps to take to reduce your cost while still allowing you to pass a CMMC assessment. So please sit back and relax, and let's hear our President and CEO, Matt Katzer, talk to us about CMMC 2.0, ways to reduce cost and pass an assessment. Please take it away, Matt.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Appreciate everyone, and welcome to the CMC webinar. I've been thinking about how the best way to handle, in terms of this topic, in terms of trying to keep the pieces in place, and also how to actually manage it in such a way that you can really plan for these events and control the events. And one of the issues associated with it, we all have this problem, is that how do you actually raise the cybersecurity maturity of your organization? And how do you actually add the necessary pieces in place to basically get your business to the next level? Even us at KAMIND, we actually have 3 different types of customer bases we support. So we constantly looking and saying, okay, from our standpoint, what we did is we implemented NIST 800 171 throughout the organization. It is part of our process. And then we add the incremental pieces in there that we need to go for, depending if your people are in terms of HIPAA high-tech trust or in terms of what they need to do for, SEC or FINRA compliance. All those fundamental things you think about are fundamental decisions that you need to make. And when I put together the material for today's presentation, it was looking at a standpoint about how do you do this so it's part of your mainstream process. And is done in such a way that you don't really, you're not trying to break the bank, so to speak. And how you break the bank is really, you wait till the last moment. That's a kiss of death. So a little bit about KAMIND. We're an Inc. 5000 company. We're 3rd year running, and we're applying for, looks like we may have a good shot making it for year 4. And we're also one of the 200 managed partners out of the 30,000 partners in the United States, the Microsoft partners. And we're also one of the 52 partners that are basically allowed to actually provide the GCC high licenses for the Azure government. So, and we've been doing 365 for a long time. And this presentation in terms of how to do CMMC and everything that we're looking back at is structured around 365 and the different types of tenants. And myself, I've published our 365 books and sold over 280,000. So when you look at KAMIND, we look at the pieces and everything else we need to do. It really comes down to this one simple statement, that we exist to prevent and solve big problems. And CMMC and NIST 800 171, it's a big problem. And the question is about how do we actually get there and how do we actually solve it? I have a couple of slides that just that I pulled together. This is an older slide that the DoD released, but I just want to frame everything, make sure we're on the same page. So, and the way to look at it, when DoD came out with their CMC specifications, this was a few years ago, what was happening in the industry is you had this whole model where it's basically was built on the side cybersecurity as a kind of a side pillar. The big change is CMC and NIST 800 171, and the current rev that you're seeing and the soon to be rev that's coming up, rev 3 with the additional controls in them, is built on this fundamental basis that you have a pillar or a cybersecurity baseline that everything's built on top of. And this is the way you have to look about everything that we do. So when we actually look at ourselves and our clients, we have either a corporate clients or an education or a government client. We structure it in such a way that we build on top of it. We basically put the pieces in place to basically build security as a on top model. So when you actually have, I want to kind of show this as a DoD town hall. It's actually on YouTube. Here's the link on it. Go listen to what the DoD CO special session had. They basically gave you a roadmap of what's happening. And this is really important. Information is king in CMMC, and it changes really a lot of times. And what really happened when DoD came out with the CMC 2.0 specification, what they did is they basically kind of took some of the CMC controls from 1.0 and they basically put those controls and said, we're not going to worry about those. Well, in the town hall, they basically kind of redefining because a lot of those things are going to come back in. So if you think in terms of what CMC 1.0 was in terms of trying to do the maturity model, proof that you're actually doing things and basically had maturity organization, thinking that you could get away without doing that or actually not having the object evidence in place, you're mistaken because you're going to have to do that. And so the question is, how do we actually do these things and how do we do it in such a way that basically makes ourselves going forward? Now, when they came out with the CMC 2.0 framework, they basically reduced it from 5 levels to 3 levels. Now, just so that we're all on the same page, they also have some in terms of what's in level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1 is a foundational level. And in DoD mind, there's 220,000 companies or in the United States in terms of defense contractors that are going to have to do a CMC framework implementation. And the way this is actually set is that 140,000 are going to be level 1, roughly 80,000 are going to be level 2, and there's only 600 to 1,000 companies going to be level 3. And that's important to kind of keep in mind in terms of what we're looking at. And what level you're going to have to do or what you need to do is going to be based on what your contract is from your prime, if you're the prime on it, or if you're a sub to a prime. So with that, so we have the pieces in place. Now, when you look at in terms of the CMC implementation timeline, the timeline hasn't really changed. It's still the same. We're right here around about in terms of where we are in 2022 in terms of contracts that are being going out. And DIBCAC is doing a lot of the certification, but we still have that deadline of 10/1/2025. They have not removed that date. Now they may change it, may make some adjustments on it, but right now they haven't moved it. So what do you do next is the key thing. And when we actually look at all that and we look in the pieces and everything else, we try to figure out is what is the things that we need to do and how do we actually look and go ahead and make those things. And that's kind of the key thing when you talk about CMMC. It really comes down to decisions. Decisions in terms of what type of business you are, what's your needs and everything else. So when I looked in terms of putting this material together, basically it comes down to 10 choices. And then we put together kind of a 10-step decision process. And then keep in mind, we're coming from an Office 365 perspective. So it's really the first decision you have to look at is really what level are you going to be at? Level 1, 2, or 3? Now, if you don't know, there's a high probability you're going to be level 1. And really the requirements of really the difference between level 1 and 2 comes down to CUI. And that's where you're going to see the big difference. The other aspect is that does your business have any Itar requirements? If you do, you're going to be in Azure Gov and you're going to be in GCC High. There's just no way to get around that. And then in terms of the other question that you want to have is, are you going to be on Office 365? So when you look at Office 365, it's kind of which decision do you want to actually have? And the other piece that you have is going to be, which SaaS tool are you going to use for data collection? And then you're going to have to go seriously look at which SaaS tool do you want to do data collection. And this is really important because there's so much data that you actually have that you basically cannot manage the amount of information, because when you actually go through an assessment, the accreditor is actually going to see what the assessment is. They want to look at the data and see the pieces. They want to see what you've done. That's why you need an assessment tool. Now, as a contractor, number 5 is going to have to, it's if you're a contractor, a prime or a sub, you're going to have to file a SPURS filing. And that basically requires a NIST 800-171 evaluation. Now, if you pick a SaaS tool, and most SaaS tools will actually generate the scores, you're half there. So you go through these processes, you're going to basically, it's all come down to what do you really do in terms of decision point 1, 2, and 3. And this kind of gets in the pieces that you need. Then you have, like, if you're doing level 2, that means you have CUI. Have you scoped the environment? Or if you look in terms of trying to complete a gap assessment, where you are from that standpoint. And then keep in mind what DoD did with level 1, you don't have to have your formal policy and procedures. We highly recommend that you do, but if you're doing level 2 or 3, the policy and procedures need to be there and they have to be accurate. And then the final aspect, what the big release of CMC 2.0 was basically having the, in terms of allowing POAMs. Now, when you go in for a formal assessment, all your POAMs have to be completed. And basically what POAMs is, they're just plans and there's plans and milestones. That's it. So when you do a gap assessment, say, hey, I got to go fix this, or I need to do this. That's basically what a POAM is. It's the plan necessary to get it. And depending on the right SaaS tool you're using, a lot of these things will be automatically generated. And then if you're going to be a level 2, you're going to have to select a C3PO for an assessment. And that's really the 10 decision process you go, and how you decide these things, and what you decide in terms of 1, 2, and 3, and 4 impacts everything in the schedule. So we're going to look at some of the decisions you make and why. And the first step is you have to literally pick your CMC level, and that's going to define the processes that you do. Now, from a Microsoft, what we did, they introduced something known as a Microsoft template. And this is known as a placemat. This is the latest one for CMC 2.0, which we'll make available for you if you submit the feedback form at the end of the presentation. But basically with your foundational controls. So when you look at something like you're using MS 365 E3, for instance, or an MS Business Premium, you really only have 17 controls, and it's a subset. So you get an idea of what you can do, and this is very doable, because that's what DoD was trying to do when they actually went through and restructured CMC 2.0. Just make it an easy lift. I mean, let's be realistic, is that in your business today, how many people don't have MFA turned on in their tenant for privileged accounts? How many people don't have MFA turned on to access all your company's trade secrets? I mean, this is a standard feature, and there's really is just the ability to turn on. And if you're running MS Business Premium, which is a small business security SKU, you have all these functionality features. You have all the necessary filtering in place. So literally, you can actually get a lot of the functionality for meeting level 1 by just getting the right subscriptions. Now, if you're using like Exchange Plan 1, or if you're using like Business Basic or Business Standard, guess what? You're not going to meet the controls. So those are decisions you need to do. Now, let's say you look at a case you want to do level 2. Well, level 2 is a little bit more complex. In this case, you're going to be you're going to conform to the NIST 800-171 across the board. And in this case, we did the MS 365 E5. Now, when we actually look at this, the reason why we chose the MS 365 E5, because Microsoft itself is going through their own accreditation and their own certification based on the MS 365 E5. So as a as myself, as a, a defense contractor, I look saying that, well, do I want to craft my own versions of a 365 control to save a couple bucks in license fees? Or do I want to mirror what Microsoft is doing so I don't have to redo all the work and spend the thousands of dollars necessary to get the additional accreditation process? Those are decisions that you make. So when you look at these things, it's basically a lot of the fundamental decisions you make on day one in terms of CMC comes really down to what licenses that you actually chose. Now, and if you're going to go for CMC level 3, totally different game, because at that time, CMC level 3 is, if you have to do the level 3 requirement, again, there's only 600 to 1,000 companies that do this, you're going to have to go through a formal DIBCAP certification, and there will be an expensive process. So the first step we want to do is step one, get the right license mix and get the pieces in place so you build that fundamental culture in your company. The second question you need to ask, or second addition to the point, is do you have an Itar requirement? And this is really important because when you talk about Itar requirements, and I had this from Microsoft, I basically put it up there, is you're going to have to be in Azure Gov and going to Microsoft GCC High. So when you do think about ITAR, what you want to try to do is saying that how do you actually segment the information? Who needs to have access to that information in terms of, during that fall under the ITAR requirement? How do you actually structure those things? Now, this is no real different than basically trying to scope CUI, because in a implementation, just like us at KAMIND, we have a KAMINDIT.us tenant and we have a KAMIND.com tenant and KAMINDIT.com tenant, which we have commercial tenants and then we have a DoD tenant. Totally different. So in essence, we built an enclave that necessarily handles that environment. So when you talk about doing ICAR, and later on we'll talk about scoping, you're going to build an enclave that basically for those users that need to have that functionality and isolate them from the rest of the organization. And keep in mind, this is nothing more than basically segmenting data in your organization so you have better controls. Now, the step 3, you look at it, it's Office 365. It's very simple, and there's got 2 versions on it. Now, if you made the decision where you're going to go like level 1 that's your CMC requirement, it makes it really issue, because what happens is on level 1, you're going to be in what we call the Azure Commercial Cloud. You're going to be basically doing the standard 365. If you're doing level 2 or level 3, then you're going to be in Azure Government. If you're doing ITAR, you're going to be in Azure Government. So as you go through this list, you're walking through the top, number 1, which CMC level am I going to go after? Number 2, which in terms of do I have ITAR requirements? Now, then basically based on the CMC level, then you pick your 365 subscription to match, and you write the necessary security SKUs. That's really the secret in this whole thing. And the way Microsoft's structured in terms of cloud services, the Azure government are in a separate data center, 100% isolated from the commercial side. There's a wholly different staff that manages it. There's a support staff that's different, so that when you actually do a support request in terms of, like, we have Microsoft Premier, for instance, and our Premier is on the commercial side, it's not on Azure government. It's a different process and a different support structure that you have to go through. And then the next step you go through is going to look at picking a SaaS tool for data collection. Now, this is really important. You kind of think about SaaS tools and you think about different things that people want to do, and it's really coming down to try to figure out, what do I really want to do, or how am I going to organize data? And that's what it's really about. And when you look at a SaaS tool, like, for instance, there's different ones that you can actually use. There's rapid fire tools, for instance. You have SourceForge has theirs. You have ComplianceForge has their version. You look at all the pieces on it. The goal of a SaaS tool is for the collection of data of those procedures and processes and policies that you use to manage your organization, and the necessary object evidence that you use to show that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Now, And this is a separate issue, and it's getting to the point in terms of with the cyber insurance cost and everything else that's going up. If you're not doing this on your day-to-day basis, even if you're not a defense contractor, you need to be doing this because you're going to end up in a situation where come 6 months, come your next cyber insurance renewal, you're not going to be able to get cyber insurance. Or if you do it and you have a claim, you're going to end up in a situation where unless you show evidence that you were doing the necessary things to collect information and doing your due diligence, they're going to deny those claims. That's how bad and how structured things are going. Now, there's a couple different tools you use for data collection. You got Microsoft Clients Compliance Manager, for instance. You got Kaseya Compliance Manager, some rapid fire tools. Comply Up is another one. Compliance Forge, Future Feed. There's a couple different ones you use. In our case, we use for what we deploy in this, we use Future Feed and a combination of Compliance Manager for a certain amount of audits from both Microsoft and Kaseya. But the bottom line is that you cannot do this work without an online tool. That's really crucial. When you actually think about what's necessary to get the pieces in place, you basically need to you have to have a central site where basically is the source of all knowledge. Now, and you want to structure it so that when you actually go through a situation and you actually have to show an auditor or an assessor that come in and evaluate it, you want to actually show the assessor that you have your act together. And that's how you drive your costs down. So all these decision factors that you go through in terms of are you level 1, 2, or 3? Do you do 365? Do you do Itar? Using what SaaS tool you use builds the fundamentals of how you want to do things. And in terms of how we actually do, and this is Future Feed, it gives you this snapshot of what's actually going on in the organization, plus the audit reports and everything else. And the other interesting thing, the tools that we typically use, we also get, and like you see on this screen, you get a SPUR score. So as you kind of build out the process, some of the things are put together. And that's key. So you're spending additional resources in terms of getting the right license type or using the SaaS tool. But what happens in the process, you drive down the cost for this other one, which is step 5 over SPUR's filing. And do you want to go through a situation where you go through the DoD scoring template like this? Or do you want to use a SaaS tool to basically help you through the process and working with someone like KAMIND that can actually go in and make sure these things are scored right so you get the right things in place? And that's the stuff that you're actually looking at, and that's what you're actually trying to do. And that's how you're going to drive the cost down. And it's all those decisions that you make or you think about as you walk through in terms of the process. And these tools that, like in this case, the scoring templates and some of the other things, DoD has made this all available free. It's on the NIST site. It's on another one they use, the Carnegie Mellon site in terms of the software engineering. There's tons of documentations available that is no charge, but the question is how to use it and which tool, because when you look at costs, there are two parts of cost. Cost is one is the terms of the fundamental expense associated with selecting the tools and paying for them. And the other is the cost that we forget a lot of times. It's the amount of labor associated to actually make these things happen because all of our time is expensive. And basically, there are things that we need to do and we need to figure out how the best way to leverage it. Now, as you've gone through those first 5 steps, you've gone through the process of, number 1, which level are you at? Number 2, do you have ITAR? Number 3, but what about 365? Number 4, doing the SaaS tool. Number 5, getting your SPUR score. Well, the next step is going to be where's CUI? Well, if you got level 1, and that's all you're worried about, you don't have to worry about CUI. But you're going to have to make sure in terms of your contracts that you're dealing with don't have a CUI clause on it, because if they do, then you're going to have level 2 requirements. And what level 2, we have this concept we call scoping. And what scoping means is that you basically take where the CUI is and you isolate it from your entire network or organization. So you kind of build an enclave. Now, you notice, like we said earlier, when we're KAMIND IT, we have a separate DoD enclave called KAMINDIT.us. That's where all the information or potential where we could actually have CUI, we've isolated in our organization so that we don't have to basically enable it so we don't have to deal with the issue of CUI and the rest of the company. But at the same time, we're basically building the company against the NIST 800-171 baseline. So we have the necessary policies and processes and procedures in place. And that's really what the secret is. Now, when you look at terms of what happens in cloud separation, this is when you do commercial or GCC high, there's something known as a security protected assets. That's like in our case is why we have a separate DUI tenant and DoD tenant. We specifically put that in place so we can isolate our support environment so it's independent in terms of how we actually manage our clients. Now, you don't have a support environment, so you're looking from a standpoint of what does this mean to me? Well, you have the same issue associated as you do CUI. How do you actually isolate it? Stick that into a GCC high tenant. But now you're going to have to look at what tools do you actually use to manage it? Because all those tools you manage, that basically will come under a scoping part of if you have a CMC level 2 requirement. So it's just things to keep in mind. And this is directly out of the CMC the DoD assessment guides. So you can actually see what the concept of assessment scope and security protected assets that have to be managed. So you have to basically look in terms of how you manage the risk in the organization. Now, the next step that we go through is the gap assessment. And in simple size, what is a gap assessment? When you get right down to it. So if we've gone through the tools, we did the necessary things. We got our 365 subscriptions. We looked in terms of, we made decisions if we have Itar or we don't. We in terms of looking at, do we have CUI and we have a right SaaS tool. It really comes out, the gap assessment is looking at what's in the specifications that you need to meet and what you don't do. And the gap in terms of a gap assessment is the difference between that, and that generates a POAM. And the best way to actually do this from a cost standpoint is download these guides from DoD to basically do the level 1 assessment guide and level 2 assessment guide, read them and look at your organizations and keep in mind and putting the pieces together. And that's how you get. Now, if we're using a third-party tool for data collection, in this case, we're using Future Feed, that's what we typically use, you can actually go through and you start building all that information. All the stuff that you're completing, all the stuff that you actually try to do as you make these decisions drives down your cost. Where you run into problems is that your decision criteria, you're deciding on your tools out of sync or your 365 subscriptions out of sync because that just drives the cost up that you have to go fix and increase the gap assessment you need to do. The other aspect is, and you get to this next step, is step 8 as we go through the process. Do you have the CMC policies in place? Well, if you're doing level 1, you don't have to have written policies. However, we strongly advise you to have your written policy and procedures. If you're to level 2, you have to put the policy and procedures in place. And the same with level 3. Now, here's some quick screenshots and instances that I put together. It's like you can get the overview of the practice from Carnegie Mellon from the Software Engineering Institute. They publish all these things in terms of the policy and procedures that they have. Or, in one of like our DIY kits, for instance, we do like level 1s where you actually have the kind of the templates and everything built together. So the thing is you can get these things everywhere, but it's really coming down to what type of tools do you use or who we actually do you partner with. Really look, Carnegie Mellon is a great source for them. The rapid fire tools using their compliance manager tools will generate stuff as well. We have a DIY starter kit that will give you like the level 1 stuff. You also have what's from Compliance Forge. But the key on policy procedures you got to keep in mind is that a lot of these things are templates. They have to be customized for your business and they have to be built for your business. And it cannot look like a template. And the other thing that you have to be careful, because when you get all these automated templates and everything else that people want to do, they tend to pretty much put policy and procedures in the same document. And guess what? The DIBCAC and assessors for the C3PO do not like that, and they will fail you on those. So you have to basically build this. So a lot of these things, you want to control costs, you want to get to that end date, you have to start now and putting the fundamentals in place in the company. So, and in this case is what we're doing. We do like third-party tools. We can actually upload the tools for those, upload the necessary pieces in place, and now we're getting all the necessary documents and services that we have in one spot. And that just helps you get to the next level. And that's really the C keeper. And then the other aspect is the POAMs. You remember we went through that gap assessment and we came up with all these plan of action to milestones that we need to do. Well, before you do your final assessment, you take all those things together and you make sure they get executed on and you make sure those things get done. And I go back again to look at the self-assessment guide. So if you want to actually go through the processes, we're specifically trying to drive down some of the costs, make this all doable. It's a planned product. It's a strategy that you have to execute against, and you have to do piece by piece. And there's the old saying is that, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. So you think of CMC the same way. Think of the 10 steps and think about how you actually walk through the organization and get your organization prepared. That's the secret. Now, when we came up and look in terms of at KAMIND, we have this model in terms of in terms of we do scoring, we do scope assessment, do gap assessment. You do the POAM, for instance, and then you actually do a formal level 2 assessment from a C3PO. It all builds into the process that you actually have. And it's all part of the same picture. So how you want to handle it, it really comes down to those 10 things. And then once you get through the process and you're going to be and you're going for level 2 certification, because level 1, yeah, you can do level 1 CMC, but it's not required. It may be by your prime, but a level 2, you're basically going to have to go through a formal assessment. And keep in mind is that from the accreditation body, there's only a limited number of people that actually can do a formal assessment as a C3PO. And also, a C3PO can assess or consult, but it cannot do both. So when you look in terms of this block my diagram that I put together in terms of how we handle CMC, the top part of this is consulting. The C3PO has a small segment of it. So what you have to do is you need a strategy to work with the organization to prepare you for that assessment with a C3PO. Follow a process model, and then you're going to end up selecting a C3PO from the AB for level 2. Now, if you're saying, hey, I'm going to be a level 3, that means you're going to do both NIST 800, 171 plus 172. Listen to the DoD webcast that they actually have published on YouTube. You're going to have to go through DIPCAC. And so it's a totally different environment. And basically, it's going to be very time consuming and very basically, you need to have your really act together. DIPCAC, in order to actually get accreditation for C3PO, all these organizations had to take their companies through a DIPCAC assessment. That's what happens when you actually go through for C3PO. So what's the best way to proceed? Well, it really comes down to the decisions you make. So what you need to do is if there's one take back you from this presentation today, look at these 10 steps. Basically, these are decisions that you need to make. So as you make a decision in terms of what level you want to be, where you're going to be on 365, what SaaS tool you have, all have impacts on how to drive the cost. You make incorrect decisions, and 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, you're going to increase your cost structure as you go down and try to basically get you through the accreditation process. And that's kind of important. That's how you basically manage. It's a strategic, you have to manage it strategically, and you have to plan for it. So, and remember that the data you collected, policy, process, procedure, training manuals, all that stuff needs to be uploaded to a collection tool for examination by assessor. Now, if you end up deciding that you want to do it on team side or using some other methods internally, that's great. But keep in mind is that the assessor needs to have access. And what you want to do, and I don't know if a lot of you been through different type of assessments or been through, different environments and depositions or whatever, but how you organize things and how you collect information. So how you show that your organization has its stuff together is going to give you credibility in terms of how you actually get through it. So if you're going to go through a formal assessment in an organization and you really haven't structured or collected your data and the information, and the assessor comes in and you don't really have your processes in a SaaS tool, you don't have your documented object evidence, you're probably going to fail. And it's about how you perceived or how you perceive. So, And in terms of also trying to get there in terms of the right CPO for the right C3PO for the assessment. And that's really key. So follow those 10 steps. So to help you, we have especially for like level 1 folks, we have a CMC level 1. It's going to probably be, they're going to have a beta in May, and we're trying to get production out in July. But it's all built on this whole idea. So it's around the Office 365, one of the 17 controls that you need. And how do we also want to include a certain number of months of there's the compliance tool. And you want to keep in mind is that you're doing those 10 steps. It's all about those 10 decision points. So we talked about a lot of different things, and we also talked about, we showed you some screenshots of the new CMC 2.0 self-assessment. So if you want to get a copy of that document, just get a feedback. We'll give you a 2.0 placemat for you, and that should give you an idea of what's the pieces and what we can do to help. With that, I'm going to pass it back over to you, Mike, and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. Nice job today. So in the chat window, I put the URL link to the CMMC guides, the assessment guides, scoping guides, everything. You'll find it. So you probably want to cut and paste that. And at this point, we can open it up for questions. If you guys want to take yourself off mute and ask away, feel free. If you want to ask your question in the chat window, please feel free. But now is our time for Q&A. Be brave, feel free. I know you guys have some questions. I might add that I applaud all of you for, starting your journey on CMMC right now, because I think one of the most important things Matt said is, getting going right away, because the runway is becoming shorter and shorter. And if you keep waiting, it's just not going to work. You're going to run out of time before you're assessed and passed by a C3PA. All right, well, I'll give it another minute if anybody can think of any questions they have, or maybe a topic for our next CMMC webinar coming up in a month or two. Do you have any ideas? I see Jeff's typing here. Thank you, Jeff. And I just put my email in the chat window as well. Again, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation with the slide deck, I find the slide deck is, really useful, so you can reference some of the material in there. All right, going once, going twice. Any other questions, comments? Jeff's typing again. We'll see. Yeah, it takes about 24 hours for these recordings to render. So if you email me tomorrow or today, I'll make sure you get it, but it probably won't be out until tomorrow. and it would be a YouTube recording. Thanks, Fran. Well, I guess you did such a good job today, Matt. Nobody really has any questions. So at this point, I will give you back 20 minutes of your day. We appreciate your time. And remember, this is an ongoing webinar series. So hopefully next month you'll join us for the Microsoft or the CMMC. Again, we appreciate your time. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.